The depot sat in darkness. Concrete revetments, rail spurs, loading cranes frozen mid-rotation, and inside those bunkers, enough 152mm artillery shells to sustain 30 days of continuous Russian barrages along the entire southern arc of the front. One strike. That was the calculation. One strike had to be precise enough to breach the outer bunker wall and trigger the secondary detonation chain. If the penetrator round hit the wrong panel, the whole operation would fizzle into a smoking crater and a footnote. If it hit right, what happened next would reshape the southern front for weeks. This is the story of what hit right. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is a reconstruction of one of the most consequential deep strike operations on the Zaporizhzhia axis, a raid that Ukrainian intelligence planners spent weeks preparing, that drone operators executed in under 4 minutes of active engagement, and that Russian logistics officers are still accounting for in their supply ledgers. Because when an ammunition hub of this scale disappears, the ripple effects don't end at the fence line. They travel 70 kilometers forward to every artillery battery that was counting on those shells. Stay with us. By the end of this breakdown, you'll understand not just what detonated, but why it detonated in exactly the sequence Ukrainian planners needed, and why Russian commanders had placed their most critical southern supply node in a location their own doctrine considered safe. It wasn't safe. Let's go back to the beginning. Deep in occupied Zaporizhzhia, along a rail corridor that Russian logistics planners had been using since the earliest months of the full-scale phase, sat what Ukrainian military intelligence identified as Object Meridian. The name came from intercepted rail manifest documentation. USAN investigators working from commercial satellite imagery had flagged the site months before the strike. A complex of reinforced concrete revetments arranged in a star pattern around a central loading platform, connected to the main rail line by 2 spur tracks, protected by a perimeter fence with vehicle barriers and guard posts at 4 corners. The initial satellite assessment estimated the site could hold between 8,000 and 12,000 tons of ordnance. That's a conservative figure. Ukrainian General Staff analysts working from Signal Intelligence, tracking the radio communications of artillery units across the southern axis, believed the number was higher. Rail manifest intercepts suggested regular shipments arriving every 4 to 6 days. The loading crane log, reconstructed from communication intercepts, showed continuous operation. This was not a transit point. This was the southern front's primary ammunition reservoir. To understand why Object Meridian existed where it did, you need to understand the pressure the Russian logistics chain had been under for the preceding months of the full-scale offensive. HIMARS strikes further north had forced Russian planners to push ammunition storage points further from the front line, deeper into occupied territory, closer to the rail network's backbone corridors, and further from Ukrainian rocket artillery range. Or so Russian planners believed. They were miscalculating the reach of what Ukrainian forces now had available. In the months before this operation, Ukrainian long-range strike capability had expanded dramatically. The combination of domestically developed strike drones, particularly the Liutyi series, with a declared range of over 1,000 kilometers, alongside Western-supplied precision munitions had pushed the envelope of what Ukraine could realistically target deep inside occupied territory. The Russians had repositioned their logistics nodes to what they calculated was a safe distance. Ukrainian planners had simply updated their range calculations and followed. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? A. The initial penetrator strike, B. The secondary detonation chain, or C. The precision terminal guidance package that made the whole sequence possible? Comment below. We'll return to this question. The intelligence preparation for this operation was meticulous in a way that reflected how Ukrainian targeting methodology had evolved across the full-scale phase of the war. Gone were the days of rough coordinates and impact area targeting. What Ukrainian GUR, military intelligence, had developed by this period was a layered picture of Object Meridian built from at least 4 independent data streams. The first stream was satellite imagery. Commercial constellation tasking provided repeated passes over the depot complex, allowing analysts to build a pattern-of-life model. When vehicles moved, when the loading crane operated, when guard rotations occurred, and crucially, which revetment bays were receiving new shipments versus which were being drawn down for distribution to forward units. The second stream was signals intelligence. Radio communications between the depot's logistics officers and the artillery units they supplied gave Ukrainian analysts a real-time picture of inventory levels and scheduled deliveries. Rail manifest data, intercepted from Russian military communications, confirmed shipment volumes and timing. The third stream was human intelligence, Ukrainian sources inside the occupied zone, the specifics of which GUR has declined to detail publicly, provided ground-level confirmation of what satellite and SIGINT were showing. guard rotation schedules. The shift change timing for the loading crane operator. The specific 60-minute window each operational cycle when the outer perimeter patrol overlapped with the crane's maintenance pause, leaving a gap in active observation coverage over the most critical revetment section. The fourth stream was drone reconnaissance. Unmanned aerial vehicles had been conducting low-profile observation passes over the site, building a three-dimensional picture of the revetment layout and identifying the precise angle of approach that offered the best penetration probability against the outer bunker wall. By the time Ukrainian planners signed off on the operation, they had a targeting package of extraordinary precision. They knew the shift change time for the loading crane. They knew which revetment held the densest concentration of propellant charges, the component most likely to trigger a sympathetic detonation chain if the initial penetrator strike achieved sufficient internal pressure. They knew the 60-meter gap in the inner perimeter fence where vehicle barriers had been removed to allow crane access. They knew the exact minute when the site would be at its most vulnerable. And then, 3 days before the planned strike window, the rail schedule changed. This was the first obstacle. A new delivery, unscheduled, larger than the regular pattern, arrived at Object Meridian, and with it came an additional security detachment. 2 armored personnel carriers positioned at the main gate. A roving patrol added to the outer perimeter. The guard rotation timing shifted by 40 minutes, closing the window that Ukrainian planners had built their approach profile around. The strike team had a choice: abort and wait for the next operational window, or adapt. They adapted. GUR analysts worked through the night, recalculating the approach vector and the timing offset. The new patrol pattern, paradoxically, created a different gap. Shorter, only 22 minutes instead of 60, but sufficient for the strike package. The additional delivery, meanwhile, had made the target even more valuable. The unscheduled shipment had pushed the estimated ordnance volume at the site to what Ukrainian analysts calculated as a peak concentration. More shells in the bunkers meant a more powerful secondary chain if the initial penetration sequence worked correctly. The adaptation took 36 hours. The strike proceeded. Stay with me. What happens in the next sequence destroys not just the depot, but the entire Russian artillery supply picture for the southern axis. What Ukrainian operators execute in the next 18 minutes reshapes the front. The strike package that Ukrainian planners assembled for Object Meridian reflected the combined arms precision that had become the signature of Ukrainian deep strike operations in this period of the war. At its core was a Liutyi long-range strike drone, the domestically developed platform that Ukrainian engineers had refined through multiple iterations, extending its range and improving its terminal guidance accuracy. The Liutyi carried a penetrating warhead designed specifically for hardened targets, a shape-charged precursor to strip reactive armor or external concrete, followed by a main penetrator round designed to drive through reinforced concrete before detonating inside the structure. The penetrator had to reach the interior of the primary revetment. That was the non-negotiable condition. The entire secondary detonation sequence depended on it. Supporting the primary strike were 4 Ukrainian Bober. Beaver, naval drones repurposed for land attack distraction. These would approach on a divergent axis, triggering Russian air defense radar and drawing the attention of any quick reaction interceptors in the area. The electronic warfare environment in the target zone had been mapped in advance. Ukrainian SIGINT operators had identified the frequencies and positions of Russian Murmansk BN and R330ZH JITEL jamming systems covering the depot's airspace. The Liutyi's terminal approach would use a navigation mode resilient to GPS denial, transitioning to optical correlation guidance for the final 3 kilometers of flight. The timing was set. The window was the 22-minute gap in the new patrol rotation, the gap that GUR had found in the adapted schedule. Entry point for the Liutyi, the northeastern approach corridor, low altitude, terrain-following mode to avoid radar detection from the depot's own surveillance systems. At the moment of launch, operators more than 400 kilometers from the target initiated the sequence. The Bober naval drones activated first, approaching on a southern vector that pulled Russian radar attention away from the northeastern approach corridor. Intercept communications recorded later showed that Russian air defense operators in the sector focused their engagement resources on the southern contacts, interpreting the Bober approach as the primary threat vector. The Liutyi came from the northeast. Terrain following. Low. Fast. 3 kilometers from the target, it transitioned to optical correlation guidance. The targeting system matched its visual feed against the preloaded image library of the revetment complex, identifying the specific panel geometry of the primary bunker's outer wall, the loading crane superstructure, the gap in the inner fence. The terminal approach was a descending profile that maximized the penetrator's impact angle against the concrete wall face. At the moment of impact, the shape charge precursor detonated against the outer concrete panel. The jet penetrated. The main penetrator followed half a millisecond later, driving through the now compromised wall and detonating inside the structure. The internal pressure wave was catastrophic. What Ukrainian planners had calculated, and what the targeting intelligence had made possible, was that the initial detonation would rupture the propellant storage containers in the primary revetment bay. The propellant was not technically explosive under normal handling conditions, but under the pressure wave of a confined internal detonation, the vaporized propellant cloud ignited. That ignition propagated through the ventilation channels, connecting the primary revetment to the secondary storage bays on either side. The secondary detonation began 11 seconds after initial impact. Combat footage captured by a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone circling at altitude shows the sequence with clinical clarity. The primary revetment disappears in a white pressure flash, so bright the drone's camera sensor bleaches for 2 frames. Then, before the smoke column has reached 50 meters altitude, a second detonation erupts from the adjacent bay. Then a third, larger than the first 2 combined. The fourth detonation. The one Ukrainian analysts had specifically planned for, the main propellant magazine in the central loading area, produces a pressure wave visible as a circular ripple in the drone footage, expanding outward from the depot at ground level. How many separate detonation events did Ukrainian analysis ultimately count in the Object Meridian strike sequence? A. 7 events, B. 11 events, or C. 14 events? We'll answer that at the end. The loading crane. The 70 metric ton gantry crane that had been operating on the site for months, the crane whose pause window Ukrainian intelligence had spent weeks mapping, was launched laterally by the 4th detonation. Satellite imagery taken in the hours after the strike shows it lying on its side 230 meters from its original position, partially embedded in the outer perimeter fence. The rail spur tracks connecting the depot to the main line were destroyed in 3 separate locations. The administrative building at the northern end of the compound, where logistics officers had been coordinating shipments, was collapsed by structural overpressure. Vehicle parking areas showed the burned-out remains of at least 11 transport trucks and 3 fuel tankers that had been on site during the strike. The perimeter guard positions were gone. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened after the detonation sequence is as important as the strike itself. Russian air defense systems in the surrounding area had been activated by the Bober drone approach and were focused on engagement solutions against those southern targets when the primary strike occurred. The response, attempts to identify and track the Liutyi strike platform, was effectively futile. The drone had already completed its attack profile and transitioned back to terrain following egress before Russian tracking systems could establish a reliable return intercept course. The 4 Bober drones, their distraction mission complete, executed a programmed withdrawal. 2 were lost to Russian air defense engagement on egress, the accepted operational cost for the mission profile. 2 returned. Ukrainian General Staff reporting in the aftermath noted the destruction of a significant logistics node on the Zaporizhzhia axis without specifying Object Meridian by name or coordinates. OSINT investigators, cross-referencing the satellite imagery of the smoke column with pre-strike imagery of the depot complex, made the identification independently within hours. But here's the question that the immediate strike footage doesn't answer, and it's the question that UkraineRadar exists to break down. What actually happened to the Russian artillery units on the southern axis after their primary supply nodes ceased to exist? The drone footage is dramatic. The pressure waves and the smoke column are viscerally powerful. But the real military consequence of destroying an ammunition hub plays out over days and weeks in the fire missions that never happen, the artillery batteries that go silent, the attacks that Russian infantry cannot call in because the shells aren't there. Intercepted Russian military communications in the days following the Object Meridian strike revealed the operational impact in real time. Artillery battalion commanders on the southern axis began reporting ammunition shortfalls within 18 hours of the strike. Forward supply points that had been drawing from the depot were informed that resupply schedules were suspended pending assessment of alternative logistics routing. The rail corridor that had fed the depot's supply chain was now being examined for alternative hub locations. But alternative locations meant longer distribution distances, slower delivery times, and reduced daily throughput. One intercepted communication, assessed as genuine by Ukrainian SIGINT analysts, showed a Russian artillery battery commander on the southern Zaporizhzhia axis reporting to his brigade that he had enough shells for 2 days of standard fire missions. After that, he would need to begin prioritizing targets because he couldn't support all the infantry positions that typically called for fire support. 2 days. That was his margin. Before Object Meridian, Russian artillery along this sector had been firing at a rate that Ukrainian General Staff assessed as consistent with approximately 4,000 to 5,000 rounds per day across all calibers. In the 72-hour period following the depot strike, Ukrainian counter-battery radar systems recorded a significant reduction in incoming artillery volume from the Russian side, a drop that analysts attributed in part to the disruption of the Meridian supply chain and in part to the physical inability of artillery units to sustain their previous rate of fire. What you believe is happening on a battlefield and what is actually happening are often separated by the quality of your logistics intelligence. Russian commanders had believed Object Meridian was safe because it was beyond the range of systems they were tracking. They hadn't updated their assessment to account for Ukrainian domestic strike drone development. That assumption, that the range envelope they remembered was still the range envelope that existed, cost them 30 days of Southern Front artillery ammunition in a single evening. This is not the first time in this war that Russian commanders have paid catastrophically for static threat assessments. At UkraineRadar, we've documented the pattern repeatedly. From the Black Sea fleet strikes to the Crimea bridge operations to the deep strike campaign against Russian fuel and logistics infrastructure. The Russian military leadership has shown a persistent tendency to calculate the threat environment based on what Ukraine had, not what Ukraine was developing. By the time the assessment updated, the weapon had already arrived. What do you think? Was the Russian decision to concentrate so much ammunition in a single depot a systemic failure, or was this an unavoidable consequence of their logistics geometry? The Zaporizhzhia corridor offered limited rail access points, and distributing ammunition across multiple smaller nodes would have reduced throughput. It's a genuine operational dilemma. Comment your analysis below. The tactical picture on the ground in the days following the strike confirmed what the logistics intercept suggested. Ukrainian General Staff reporting indicated that Russian infantry assaults in the southern Zaporizhzhia sector, assaults that had previously been supported by intensive artillery preparation, became less frequent and less intensive in the period immediately after the depot strike. Frontline Ukrainian units reported reductions in incoming artillery fire that their commanders directly attributed to Russian supply disruption. Ukrainian artillery, meanwhile, was able to operate more freely. Counter-battery missions that would previously have drawn immediate and heavy Russian response now encountered lighter, more inconsistent return fire. Ukrainian armored units used the reduction in artillery pressure to conduct several localized counterattacks on the southern axis, none decisive in terms of territory, but all exploiting the temporary degradation of Russian fire support capability. If you believe tactics win wars, and you believe that logistics is the foundation of tactics, type UkraineRadar in the comments. The Russian response to the depot strike was revealing. Within 48 hours, satellite imagery showed increased activity at alternative storage facilities in the broader region, sites that Russian logistics planners had presumably been holding in reserve. Truck convoys began appearing on road corridors that had previously seen minimal logistics traffic, suggesting a rapid attempt to redistribute ammunition from more distant storage points to forward supply positions. Rail traffic patterns on the main southern corridor showed rerouting activity consistent with the establishment of new distribution nodes. This is emergency logistics. This is what a military looks like when it's improvising around a hole that suddenly appeared in its supply chain. And improvised logistics is slower, more expensive in fuel and vehicle wear, and more vulnerable to interdiction than planned logistics. Ukrainian drone operators, aware that Russian logistics would be scrambling, began targeting the truck convoys that appeared on the new road corridors. Thermal-equipped reconnaissance drones tracked the vehicle movement patterns, and FPV strike drones were vectored onto individual trucks carrying ammunition. It became a secondary interdiction campaign, exploiting the chaos that the Object Meridian strike had created. Each truck destroyed was more shells that didn't reach the front line. Each crater in a road surface was additional delay in the resupply timeline. The compounding effect of the initial strike and the follow-on interdiction campaign extended the artillery supply disruption well beyond what the single depot strike alone would have achieved. What NATO planners would have done differently here is worth considering. NATO logistics doctrine would likely have distributed the same total ammunition volume across multiple dispersed sites with redundant rail and road access, limiting the impact of any single strike. Russian military doctrine, shaped by Soviet-era logistics practices built around large central depots and hub-and-spoke distribution networks, concentrated supply at choke points. That concentration enabled efficient throughput under normal conditions. It created catastrophic vulnerability to a single, successful deep strike. What would NATO have done differently in the logistics architecture that made Object Meridian possible? Comment your analysis. the Ukrainian operators who executed this strike, whose names and specific units remain classified, as is standard for deep strike operations, represented a capability that didn't exist when the full-scale phase began. The Liutyi drone platform had evolved through operational feedback loops, with each strike generating data that engineers used to refine the guidance systems, the penetrator warhead design, and the electronic warfare resilience of the navigation suite. By the period of this operation, the platform reflected more than a year of combat refinement. This is the innovation pattern that UkraineRadar has documented across the full-scale phase. Ukraine did not begin the war with this capability. It built it, under fire, against an adversary that was simultaneously trying to develop electronic warfare countermeasures for exactly this class of threat. The Ukrainians were building the aircraft while flying it, and they were doing so faster than Russian EW engineers could build the jamming systems to stop them. That development velocity is arguably the most important military story of this conflict. Not any individual strike, however consequential Object Meridian was, but the systematic, accelerating development of a domestic strike capability from a starting point of almost nothing, funded and encouraged by Western partners who provided the technology foundation and the training, but left Ukrainian engineers to solve the specific operational problems that only come from fighting a real war. The secondary detonation that Ukrainian planners needed, the one that had to work or the whole operation would fizzle, worked because Ukrainian analysts had built a targeting package precise enough to put the penetrator exactly where the propellant storage was most concentrated. That precision came from weeks of satellite imagery analysis, signals intelligence correlation, human source reporting, and drone reconnaissance synthesis. It came from knowing more about the target than the people defending it. This is modern warfare as Ukraine has learned to fight it, not through mass. Russia still has mass, in artillery tubes, in infantry numbers, in tank inventory. Ukraine wins individual engagements through precision, through intelligence superiority in specific target sets, and through the ability to strike at distances that Russian commanders had decided were beyond Ukrainian reach. Object Meridian fell into that last category. Russian logistics planners had positioned it at a distance they believed was safe. The Liutyi's operational range made that calculation obsolete. And by the time Russian commanders updated their threat assessment, the depot had already ceased to exist. The silence on the Russian artillery net that followed was the loudest signal. In the weeks after the strike, Ukrainian OSINT investigators tracked the recovery efforts at the Object Meridian site through commercial satellite imagery. What they found was consistent with the assessment of a total loss event. The revetment complex had not simply been damaged. It had been structurally collapsed across multiple bays. The loading crane was unrecoverable. The rail spur infrastructure required full replacement. The perimeter security infrastructure was gone. Russian military engineering units did begin work on clearing the site within 2 weeks of the strike. But clearing is not reconstructing. And reconstructing is not restoring the logistics throughput that Object Meridian had been providing to the Southern Axis artillery network. The Southern Front fought differently in the weeks after the depot strike. Drone operators on both sides, but with Ukrainian advantage in ISR coverage. Watch the change manifest in real time. Russian infantry attacks that had previously been preceded by 30 to 40 minutes of intensive artillery preparation now went in with lighter or no preparatory fires. Sometimes they went in with no preparation at all, and Ukrainian defenders, who had come to rely on the artillery preparation as a warning signal that an attack was incoming, suddenly found themselves facing infantry that appeared without the usual announcement. That adaptation, attacking without artillery preparation to preserve ammunition, created new tactical problems for Russian infantry. Artillery preparation suppresses defenders and degrades fighting positions. Without it, Russian infantry moved against Ukrainian positions that were fully alert, fully manned, and fully ready. The casualty differential in those engagements was sharply negative for the Russian side. Intercepted communications from Russian company commanders in the southern sector showed the frustration this created. Units requesting artillery support and receiving notification that fire missions were not available. Battalion commanders being told to achieve their objectives with organic weapons, mortars, RPGs, machine guns, rather than the artillery preparation they had planned for. Operational planning built around fire support availability that had simply disappeared. This is what destroying an ammunition depot actually means at the tactical level. It's not just the immediate explosion. It's every fire mission that doesn't happen for the next 4 weeks. It's every infantry attack that goes in underprepared. It's every defensive position that isn't suppressed when it should be. The strategic impact of a single successful deep strike propagates outward through every link in the chain that the destroyed node was supporting. The Zaporizhzhia axis, which Russian planners had been developing as a potential offensive direction, effectively lost its fire support advantage for a critical period. Ukrainian forces used that period to improve defensive positions, rotate units, and prepare for the eventual resumption of Russian pressure. Pressure that, when it came, would have to be sustained with a reconstructed and dispersed logistics system that was inherently less efficient than what had existed before. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. And then it invents ways to exploit the effects of those new ways of fighting. The Object Meridian strike was not an isolated event. It was the opening move in a follow-on interdiction campaign that extended the disruption effect by weeks beyond what the initial strike alone would have achieved. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. The lesson of Object Meridian is not simply that ammunition depots can be destroyed. Military historians and logistics planners have known that since the first century of artillery warfare. The lesson is specifically about the interaction between the evolution of Ukrainian strike range and Russian assumptions about safe distances. Russian military logisticians built their southern front supply architecture on a threat model that was accurate for the first phase of the full-scale conflict and became increasingly outdated as Ukrainian domestic strike capability matured. Every time Russia has made that assumption, that the threat landscape it understood at one moment was the threat landscape that would persist. Ukraine has eventually demonstrated the error. Crimea was once considered beyond reach. The bridges were once considered beyond reach. The Black Sea Fleet's operating area was once considered beyond reach. The fuel infrastructure in the Russian interior was once considered beyond reach. Object Meridian was once considered beyond reach. None of them were. Now, the answer to the technical quiz from earlier in this breakdown, Ukrainian analysis identified 14 separate detonation events in the Object Meridian strike sequence. The 14-event chain was the outcome of the precise penetrator placement against the primary propellant storage bay. The placement that Ukrainian targeting intelligence had made possible through weeks of layered reconnaissance. The initial penetrator detonation triggered 3 immediate secondary explosions in the connected revetment bays. The propellant vapor cloud from those 3 events then ignited through the ventilation system, producing 6 additional pressure events across the adjacent storage areas. The main propellant magazine in the central loading area, the 4th major detonation visible in the drone footage, triggered 4 final events as the structural collapse of the loading platform brought pressure waves through the underground connecting tunnels to the rail intake bays. 14 events, 1 strike, 1 22-minute window, weeks of intelligence preparation. So the closing questions. Was concentrating the Southern Front's primary ammunition reserve in a single site, even a site that Russian logistics planners assessed as being at safe distance, the right strategic choice? The throughput efficiency argument is real. Distributed storage means distributed logistics overhead, slower delivery cycles, and more complex inventory management. But the single point of failure risk, in an environment where Ukrainian deep strike capability was continuously expanding, made Object Meridian a catastrophic liability waiting for the right intelligence package to activate it. Could Russian air defense have prevented this? The Bober distraction approach worked as intended, but a more comprehensive layered air defense architecture over the depot specifically. Dedicated radar coverage, point defense systems integrated with the perimeter security, would have significantly complicated the strike. Russian commanders chose to rely on distance as their primary protection and did not invest in active defense of the site. When the definition of safe distance changes every time an adversary deploys a new platform, passive defense by distance is a gamble. And finally, what would you have done differently as the Ukrainian strike planner when the patrol schedule changed 3 days before the operation? The 22-minute replacement window was tighter than the original 60-minute window. The additional Russian security presence increased the risk of the operation being detected in its final approach phase. Would you have waited for a cleaner window, even if that meant allowing the unscheduled ammunition delivery to be distributed forward, reducing the target value but increasing operational safety margin? Or would you have adapted, as Ukrainian planners did, accepting the tighter window in exchange for striking at peak target value? Comment your answers. The people who plan these operations are asking exactly these questions in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information and lives in the balance. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Will Ukraine be able to sustain this tempo of deep strikes as Russian air defense adapts further? Comment yes or no, because this is the central strategic question of the next phase of the conflict, and your read on it matters to this community. The Zaporizhzhia steppe is quiet at the Object Meridian coordinates now. The satellite imagery shows a cleared site, the rubble removed, the rail spurs torn up, the perimeter fence gone, an empty rectangle where a logistics hub once sustained an entire front. The wrecks don't remain here. They've been cleared away. but the absence is its own monument. A hole in the Russian supply chain that took months to partially fill. An echo in every artillery battery that went silent because the shells weren't there. A reminder that modern warfare reaches further than you think, arrives faster than you expect, and punishes the assumption of safety with a finality that no logistics rebuild can fully undo. Real tactics. Real consequences. UkraineRadar. Stay vigilant.